Welcome to the Oxbridge Speaker Series presentation of Risky Business, Surviving the Future of ISO 9001-2015. I'm Christopher Paris, founder of Oxbridge Quality Resources and the recipient of many quality awards. If by awards you mean lawsuit threats and harassing emails from angry ISO people. So with me at the wheel, you know you're in for a fun ride as we take a critical look at the coming draft of ISO 9001, along with its strange new requirement, risk-based thinking. A lot of people have said that I may be doomsaying throughout this presentation, so I would like to get one thing out of the way. You all are going to die. The Earth will be sucked into the sun eventually, and human life will be extinct. Presuming that doesn't happen over the next few minutes, we should be fine. That is probably the end of all the doomsaying you'll get out of me during this presentation. So we're going to talk about ISO for most of this, and it's important to know what ISO actually stands for. Indefinite Standard Obsolescence. You see, ISO has a biological clock that's ticking and ticking and ticking. So it thinks that every once in a while it should revise standards. Now some standards like material standards, technical standards, they tend not to revise very often and they don't need to be revised. But management systems could evolve over time, so ISO likes to, every 5 years or so, take a look at a standard to see if it requires a revision or not. It does this with ISO 9001, and we've fallen into a pattern where every other revision of ISO 9001 is a major change, with the others in between being minor changes. So when the standard was released in 1987, that of course was a big deal, but the decision was made in the next revision, 1994, that it would be a minor change. The presumption then was that in 2000 would be a major change, and it was. And then in 2008 there was no change at all, just some language clarifications, and it was considered an amendment. And the presumption has always been that the next version in 2015 would again be a major change, with the next following version sometime in the 2020s being a minor change. And that's important because what it tells us is that whatever we get in 2015, we're going to be stuck with for probably about 15 years. The other thing that happens is the focus of the standard changes with each major revision. So the first two standards were largely inspection-based, based on the old MILQ 9858 standard. And then after that, in the 2000s, we became process-based, where the process approach was introduced and a couple more quality principles according to that. The new version is going to be risk-based, which, as we'll talk today, was pulled out of thin air. And presumably after that, we'll get faith-based standards, or something. But who are the players in this story? And that's important. And there are two major players that we need to discuss, one of which you probably know, the other you probably don't. The player you probably know is ISO Technical Committee 176, or TC 176. They're responsible for developing and writing the ISO 9000 family of standards, quality management system standards. And they're comprised of delegates from the member nations of ISO, some 170 nations or so. And they get together and they draft consensus standards based on the opinions of those delegates, who are, again, appointed by the member nations to represent their points of view from their home countries. They then vote on those drafts and prior to publication, and they hand a final draft to ISO, who then hits the print button and publishes it as a consensus standard. At least that's the way it's supposed to happen. The player you may not know about is called the ISO Technical Management Board, or the TMB. The TMB is a bureaucratic body that sits over the technical committees, and it is responsible for setting the policies and managing those technical committees. For example, it sets the rules for how the TCs are going to function and operate and vote and all that kind of thing. Now, they can form or disband the TCs based on their whim. If a TC is working on a standard that is obsolete, it would disband the technical committee. What some people don't know is that TMB can also disband a technical committee if that technical committee doesn't abide by the rules set by the TMB. So the TMB is the boss over the technical committees. Now, occasionally, they also develop ISO guides and sometimes even standards, even though they're not comprised of representative delegates assigned by the various nations. That's where things get a little sketchy. Now, periodically, before a standard is to undergo a change, there's a vote done. in order to determine the beginnings of the design spec. This survey is sort of a gut check of the technical committee members to know what kind of change they want to do coming into a new standard. And the options are that there would be a major change, or a minor change, or an amendment, which again is just clarifications with no changes whatsoever except for language, or to ratify the standard as is and make no changes whatsoever, or to withdraw the standard in the case of maybe it's obsolete or not. In the case of ISO 9001-2015, it was elected to be a major change. Yay. So the plot is set in motion. If you're working on TC 176, the first marching order you're going to get is that, by the way, it's going to be a major change. So you roll up your sleeves and you say, okay, now I know what we're going to do. Except there's a subplot, and the subplot involves stuffed kangaroos. Well, actually not stuffed kangaroos, but we're going to use them as a metaphorical stand-in for the Australians. You see, back in 1994, Australia and New Zealand published a document called AS/NZS 4360 on risk management. Now, it's an important document because it's the first cross-national attempt at making a standard on risk management. And it kind of becomes an international standard in that pretty soon it's supported by both Japan and Canada and other countries, and in general, that first draft is actually a really good standard on risk management. And one name to watch on that is that Kevin Knight, an Australian, is a top contributor within that group. We're going to see his name pop up here and there as we go through this. So in 1998, the ISO Technical Management Board begins to consider a standard on risk terminology. Now, not risk management, but just a standard set of definitions that could be universally applied. We think that this was prompted by Japan, and specifically the Japanese friend of Kevin Knight. So later that year, the TMB forms a working group, assigns Japan as the secretariat, and gives Kevin Knight the role of convener. By 2002, the document called ISO IEC Guide 73 is published. It manages to get approval from both ISO and its sister organization, the International Electrotechnical Commission. Now, around 2004, Kevin Knight approaches the TMB with a plan to convert his AS/NZS 4360 into an ISO standard on risk management. Therefore, no longer making it just an Australian standard, but a true international standard published by ISO itself. The TMB agrees, but takes on the task itself without forming a technical committee. It appoints Knight as the head of its working group. But a parallel timeline begins to emerge at the same time. In 2009, ISO Technical Management Board begins working on a document called ISO Guide 83, or the high-level structure. Now, the purpose of Guide 83 is to provide its technical committees a set of guidelines on how their standards should be structured: clause structure, paragraphs, clause titles, headings, etc. So that all of these standards start to look the same, and that will make things easier if you're trying to implement an integrated management system. So 9001 will have the same clause structure as 14001, alongside 22000 and 27001. All of these standards will follow this high-level structure of clause numbering and formatting and headings. But the mission creep slowly leads to the TMB not just dictating format, but content. For example, TMB began to look at all these standards and realized that they all generally had a policy of some sort. The 9000 has a quality policy, 14000 has an environmental policy. So it dictates inside the high-level structure that you should have a policy. Well, as soon as that it did that, it began to dictate content, because perhaps a technical committee might develop a standard that doesn't need a policy, or maybe it wants 3 policies or 10 policies. Well, the high-level structure dictates you'll have one overarching policy. That's content. The Australians, meanwhile, also working in these same offices, they chime in and they say, hey, by the way, add risk to the high-level structure. And the TMB obliges. Now, this is significant, one of the most significant things that happens in ISO history, because this is the first time a single profession has been able to influence every possible ISO management system standard that it has ever made and will ever make. Now, if you imagine, for an example, if someone in the quality profession had managed to convince ISO that every other quality system, every other management system standard would include quality in it. That includes environmental. It includes food safety. It includes information security management. Imagine if quality had that kind of power. Or alternatively, let's say that the information security management people on their technical committee managed to convince the TMB to include a clause about information security management in every other standard, such as ISO 9000 or 14000. Well, neither of those ever happened. But in this case, the risk managers managed to convince ISO that their concept, risk, should be included in every possible standard. Now, if you zoom out far enough, you can probably think to yourself, well, that makes sense because risk is everywhere. But when you start to get into the ground, it is conceivable that a management system standard could exist without having risk applied to it. But that's no longer the case. According to the TMB, buying into the feedback from the Australians, now all the standards are going to have risk included in it. Meanwhile, another parallel timeline emerges. Over at Guide 73 on risk terminology, the IEC, that's ISO's sister body, the International Electrotechnical Committee, rejects the draft on risk terminology. This is important because it's published without the IEC logo, and this indicates the first cracks in ISO's vision of a universally accepted vision of risk. So already within ISO, rifts are forming on its approach to risk. In fact, ISO now has 39 different definitions of the word risk spread out over 140 different publications. So you could say that ISO Guide 73, which attempted to standardize risk definitions, is a major failure. Meanwhile, in 2009, the TMB finally publishes ISO 31000 as a risk management standard. However, it's important to note that the TMB published it. There's still no technical committee for risk management formed at this time. A technical committee would be later formed in, I think, 2011, but the first version of ISO 31000 was published as a TMB document without the technical committee consensus machine behind it. So as we said, risk is added to the ISO Guide 83 high-level structure. However, in 2011, Guide 83 fails to get approval because even though it's being written by the TMB, there is the minimum requirement that a certain percentage of the people involved in the committee would approve it, and even within the TMB, they could not get that level of approval. So the document was scrapped at the draft stage. In fact, you could still buy a copy of Guide 83 and see that it's in draft stage from the ISO website. ISO then does an incredible thing, and a bit nefarious, in that the Technical Management Board copies and pastes the rejected Guide 83 text into an internal document that no one's ever heard of called the Consolidated ISO Supplement. It's added at the end of this document in an annex called Annex SL, which is probably why you've heard the term Annex SL to describe this high-level structure. Now, the Consolidated ISO Supplement is normally just a document published by the TMB for which the TCs, the technical committees, have to abide, and it just presents some really boring information. For example, it defines how TCs should be structured organizationally, how they're going to develop their deliverables, and it includes lots of rules on procedures for calling meetings, the languages that will be used at meetings, how they're going to distribute documents, and things like that. It's all very, very dull stuff. However, it's always been understood that the Consolidated ISO Supplement was, in fact, mandatory. In the beginning of the document, it actually says this is a set of procedural rules to be followed by ISO committees. And it's understood that you really don't have any option if you're on a technical committee. Where things get a little strange is that in Annex SL, in the third edition, there was a sentence in there that said deviations from Annex SL are permissible on the condition that they're reported to the Technical Management Board with detailed rationale. Now, I was involved in some conversations with various parties on this and never quite got an answer, but it appeared that the TMB could reject that deviation. And in one case, it appears that they actually did. However, no one in ISO is admitting this, but it may be moot, because the fourth edition of the ISO Consolidated Supplement deleted the paragraph entirely. Now, I don't know if there's a fifth edition, but this is the latest information I have, and right now that sentence is not in there. So now there's a major plot change. Not only do you have to make a major change, but you're going to have to adopt the Annex SL structure as well. And of course, because Annex SL calls out risk, you now need to include risk in ISO 9001-2015. The kangaroo is very happy. Meanwhile, yet another parallel timeline begins to emerge. You see, the TMB has been measuring the technical committees against dashboards, one of which is intended to make sure that they complete their standards faster. They establish goals to speed up the publication dates. And furthermore, the TMB declares that key previous review stages, including the working draft, committee draft, and the final draft international stages, are now optional. So you could see here where they went from 6 previous stages to only 3. Now technically, an early working draft could be written, then followed by a draft international standard right to publication. That cuts out 3 potential review stages within a technical committee. And again, all of this is to increase the speed by which a standard gets to the printers. Because remember, ISO 9000 makes its revenue by the publication of standards. They do not make any money if standards are tied up in committee. So your plot just got even more complicated. Not only do you have to make a major change to your standard and adopt Annex SL's structure, now you have to implement risk, and you've got to do the whole thing by September 2015. Making this mandatory.